Good morning, class. Today we are going to start our first, real chapter in our exercise physiology course. And you might notice we're starting with chapter 5. The first 4 chapters of the book are about nutrition, and from what I understand, you will be getting plenty of nutrition information from Dr. Carter. So we're going to jump into a chapter which, if you've looked ahead, it seems a little complicated, and it is. But my overall goal, not only with this lecture and this chapter, but this whole semester, is to really provide you all with a foundation in exercise science. So I'm going to try to make things as simple as possible. However, the concepts, they are going to be difficult. Okay, so today we're going to go into introduction to energy transfer and really talk about energy, where it comes from, and how we use it, right? That's kind of our overall goal, and specifically how we use it during exercise, of course. So, whenever we talk about energy, the first thing that is often discussed is the first law of thermodynamics, okay? So we see on the slide here how it is defined. The definition that I've always heard and used is that energy is neither created nor destroyed. It is merely transformed from one form to another, okay? So we don't make energy in our body. We receive energy from somewhere else. It is stored or immediately used in our body, and then we use that stored energy to perform some sort of a task, which of course in this class, that task is going to be always referring to exercise. Okay, so again, the body does not produce energy. It does not consume energy or use up energy. It merely transforms energy from one form into another, and so on. Okay, ultimately, as we'll identify here shortly, we take in what is called non-usable or non-biologically usable energy that our body cannot use, okay? And most often we take that in through what are known as the 3 macronutrients, which are protein, carbohydrate, and fat, okay? We cannot directly use those things as energy. We have to convert those things into the biologically usable form of energy, which is known as ATP. Okay, that stands for adenosine triphosphate. More commonly, it is referred to by the acronym ATP. Okay, and that is the biologically usable form of energy. Okay, so there are multiple steps that ultimately convert the ultimate source of energy, which we'll identify in a second, into the macronutrients, okay, and then ultimately inside of our body, once we consume those macronutrients, we convert carbohydrate, protein, and fat into ATP, and that ATP is then used to provide the energy necessary to perform exercise or to perform physical work, okay? So again, first law of thermodynamics, we're converting energy from one form into another. And in the case of humans, we need to convert it into a form that is biologically usable for us, a form of energy that our body can use to produce or conduct work. And work is is a word I can use interchangeably with exercise. Exercise is physical work. So when I say work, I'm talking about literally the work of contracting your muscles through various activities. Another way to look at this, especially when it gets into the storage, is we have this potential energy, okay, that we store, okay? When we go through that process of converting energy from one form to another, once we get ATP produced, we don't automatically use it, right? We store a small amount of energy as ATP, and that represents potential energy, okay? Then when we need to perform work or exercise, the potential energy is sort of released and it becomes kinetic energy. Kinetic energy relates to the energy or the production of motion, as well as the releasing of energy as heat. Okay, you might think of this as the example, as the figure shows here, as sort of like a dam. When the water is stopped by the dam, that represents potential energy. Okay, the water held up here is, sorry, that didn't need that to happen. Once the water is released from the dam, then the potential energy is transformed into kinetic energy, and that water can be used to produce electricity, etc. Now, I just noticed, due to my somewhat unfamiliarity with this recording system, that I skipped a very important slide. So I'm going to scroll back to slide 1, okay? And this is how I actually wanted to preview what we were talking about today, right? So work, as I defined for you guys earlier, is exercise, any sort of physical movement, moving an object, or just moving your skeletal muscles, okay, is going to require energy, okay? In order for that energy, or in order for that work to be performed, we have to have some energy. So I identify for you all what is the ultimate source of energy on the planet Earth. And of course, it is the sun, okay? So what we see, kind of jumping back to the first law of thermodynamics, we need to convert energy from a form that we cannot directly use down to a form that our biology can use to produce work, okay? So what we see is this transformation of energy that ultimately starts with the sun, okay? The sun releases solar radiation. On the planet Earth, then, plants, trees, other plants, etc., grass, they harness that energy directly from the sun, okay, and they store it as carbohydrate, okay? So we see then solar radiation gets converted to carbohydrate energy by plants, okay? Now, we could directly eat those plants, therefore consuming the carbohydrate, right, which we identified earlier, as a macronutrient. And then inside our body, that carbohydrate can be converted into ATP, which I previously defined for you all as the biologically usable form of energy, okay? We could also have another step added into this energy conversion process, where animals, such as cows, for example, eat the grass, okay? And as animals digest that carbohydrate, they convert that energy into protein and fat, right? So then we can consume those macronutrients by consuming the animals, okay? So again, what we're ultimately seeing is we're taking the ultimate source of energy from the sun, converting that energy first into plants, then into animal protein and fat. Then as we consume those things through our diet, therefore consuming these 3 macronutrients, we can either store energy, leaving it as potential energy as carbohydrate, protein, or fat, and or convert those macronutrient molecules into ATP, which we identified a second ago as the biologically usable form of energy. Okay, so again, ATP stands for adenosine, so there's the A, triphosphate, there's your T, there's your P, okay? We're going to come back to ATP, not really much more in this lecture, but in future lectures, ATP will be kind of a central focus of especially the energy systems. Once we get into aerobic metabolism and anaerobic metabolism, glycolysis, etc., we're going to be talking about ATP quite a bit, okay? And those things that I just mentioned, aerobic and anaerobic metabolism, can be summarized in a sort of specific field that is known as bioenergetics. Bioenergetics, creating energy for the biological organism. And again, what that process looks like, bioenergetics involves converting carbohydrate, fat, and protein into ATP. ATP is required for the human organism to be able to perform physical work, okay? So, sorry that I skipped by that slide. That was completely unintentional. But as we then go into the first law of thermodynamics, again, we're talking about converting solar energy ultimately into ATP. ATP we can use to produce or carry out that physical work, okay? And then again, to summarize, potential energy lies in not only the macronutrients, but also in ATP. And then once we start performing that work, the energy is released kinetically to produce motion, okay? But some of it is also released as heat, okay? You might notice when you're exercising, what happens to your body? Temperature elevates, right? And that's because roughly 25% of the energy liberated from ATP goes towards the production of physical work. The other 75% of that energy gets wasted or released as heat, okay? So that heat still represents energy, but it ultimately sort of just moves into the atmosphere, moves into the environment around us. It doesn't actually directly contribute to work, but that does get converted, again, from one form of energy to another. So again, you might have noticed a central part of this is ultimately we need to be able to produce ATP, okay? So inside the body, there are several sort of mechanisms that are used to convert energy, okay? We can synthesize or build up things, which we do in the case of ATP, okay? And we do that by really taking the potential energy that lies in those macronutrients that I talked about on the last couple slides, okay? Now, carbohydrate, protein, and fat, they are composed of these 4 atoms that we see here. Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen make up carbohydrate and fat, okay? And then nitrogen is included in protein, okay? Now, the way that those atoms are bound together, they're bonded, okay? And as part of those bonds, we have the negatively charged molecules, which are known as, does anybody know? Not protons, those are the positives. We have electrons, those are the negatively charged molecules. When we break those bonds apart, and this is what our energy systems do, those electrons are released, okay? And those electrons allow us to synthesize or build up ATP, okay? So the potential energy found in carbohydrate, protein, and fat is ultimately found in those electrons, okay? And as our energy systems break apart those bonds, the electrons are released, and we are then able to synthesize or, again, build up ATP, which we can either store for later use or immediately use if we are exercising. When we only store a very small amount of ATP. When we're exercising, though, our energy systems really start ramping up production. ATP is produced, and then it is immediately used to fuel whatever movement we're doing, be it running, lifting weights, playing basketball, jumping, etc. Okay, so again, just to summarize the key point of this slide, the macronutrients, which represent our potential energy, what we consume through our diet, they are composed of these 4 atoms in some arrangement and in some different numbers. We're not going to get into the specifics of that in this class in all likelihood. But by breaking those bonds apart and liberating the electrons from those bonds, those electrons are used to help synthesize ATP, okay? So as a part of this building up process, the synthesis, we have 2 different types of reactions that we want to kind of briefly touch on just to introduce these to you all, okay? The 2 different types of reactions are known as endergonic and exergonic, okay? In an endergonic reaction, we are storing or absorbing energy, okay? Now, when we're producing ATP, we could call that an endergonic reaction, okay? Because we're synthesizing this molecule and energy is used to bind this molecule together, okay? Now, if we immediately then use that ATP for energy, a different type of reaction occurs, and that is what is known as an exergonic reaction, where energy is released, okay? So looking at these graphs here, again, we're building up, we're synthesizing, we're producing energy. And actually producing is an incorrect word, right? We said energy is not produced, it is merely transferred from one form to the other. So as we break apart our macronutrients, we are transferring energy from the carbohydrate, protein, or fat into ATP, which is our product, right? Energy is supplied through those electrons to allow us to produce ATP, okay? And that is an endergonic process. Now, for exercising, that ATP that we produce now becomes the reactant, okay? And that ATP molecule is split apart, okay? Energy is a key part of an ATP molecule, as we've identified earlier. And later in the semester, we'll see the full equation for ATP and what it looks like. But just know for now, energy is a key component of ATP. And when we're exercising, the ATP molecule is kind of split apart, it's blown up, and the energy is released, allowing the product of work to be accomplished, okay? So very much, with bioenergetics, which again is the production of ATP, we have this relationship of both endergonic reactions, allowing us to produce ATP, and then the exergonic reactions allowing us to use the ATP to produce whatever work that we're doing, okay? So just make sure that you have sort of a fundamental understanding of the difference between these two reactions. This is one of your lecture study questions. Endergonic reactions absorb energy, exergonic reactions release energy. Okay, so as we then begin to use that energy, now we're going to sort of introduce briefly, we're not going to get into this one nearly as much, what is known as the second law of thermodynamics, okay? As energy is converted from one form into another, the overall amount of energy tends to degrade or slowly sort of become weaker, okay? And we see this mainly in what I mentioned earlier when I talked about the percentages of ATP that are directly contributing to work and that are released as heat, right? Does anybody remember what I said was the rough percentage of energy that directly contributes to the production of physical work? I'll give you a second to try to remember that. It was 25%, right? So of that energy that we harness from the sun through the macronutrients into our body, only about 25% of that energy actually goes towards the production of work, okay? We then have this unusable form, at least for us as humans. About 75% of that energy gets released as heat, okay? So we can't take all of the energy from the sun and use it to produce work. We only can use about 25% of it. And that's what the second law of thermodynamics tells us. So this diagram sort of summarizes what we've talked about so far. As you've no doubt sort of picked up on, there are different forms of energy. Ultimately, as we've identified, the sun is the ultimate source of energy on our planet, okay? Plants, as we see here, directly harness that energy, okay? We can also use solar panels now in 2020 to harness that energy as well. But then we convert that energy into other forms, okay? Solar energy can be converted to chemical energy or electrical energy by solar panels. Plants convert light energy into chemical energy, and then we consume that chemical energy in the form of the 3 macronutrients, right? Kinetic energy in water movement can be, which would be mechanical energy, right? The mechanical energy of the water going over the dam can again be converted into electric energy. So water movement can be used to produce electricity to be utilized by people's homes, right? The first law of thermodynamics tells us that energy is converted from one form to another, okay? It doesn't ever disappear, it just gets converted, right? And the heat is one thing that we've sort of indicated might be a waste product, but if we think about this, right, in the wintertime, the heat that can be liberated from energy conversion can be used to heat our homes, which is important in the winter time, obviously. So here we have some examples of the energy conversion. I've already talked about this somewhat, so we're not going to go through this too much now, but here it gives examples of, again, the endergonic process of how energy is transferred from the sun into plants, and potential energy is built up in this endergonic process by the production of carbohydrate, which is really what plants are. Plants are carbohydrates, okay? And then in respiration, which is another term that is used for bioenergetics, we see the macronutrient carbohydrate, in this case, is used to produce ATP. ATP is then used to conduct work. And again, that is an exergonic process, the releasing of energy, where endergonic is the storing or building up of energy. So as far as biological work in humans, the one that I've indicated and talked about thus far in this lecture is mechanical work, right? So mechanical work would be exercise, okay? The movement of our joints using our skeletal muscles can be defined as mechanical work, okay? That mechanical work requires energy. Again, that energy comes from ATP. But in this slide, it's asking us, well, what else requires energy in the body? Well, there is the need for chemical energy, okay? So the process of transforming energy from a macronutrient into ATP or storing it as amino acids into protein, muscle protein, etc., that actually requires energy as well. So when we get into the energy systems in a couple chapters, you'll see that there is an energy requirement. We have to put in energy to get energy, okay? So some of the ATP that we have in our body is used for that conversion process, for the production of chemical work, okay? Then we also have transport, okay? So when you all take biology or human anatomy and physiology classes down the road, you'll learn that our cell membranes have transporters that allow things to move in and out of cells, okay? Some of those transporters require energy in order for them to function. So in this example, this is what is known as the sodium-potassium pump, and this helps us maintain the concentration of sodium potassium inside and outside of our cells, which is a major requirement for how our nervous system works, okay? These transport proteins require energy, okay? So we see in our body multiple needs for energy, not just the production of mechanical work using our muscles, but also the chemical conversion process and the transportation process. So how we could summarize this is there is a great need for energy in our body at all times, okay? So the need for and the requirement for efficient ATP production cycles, and not just one, but multiple, is present, okay? And we're going to see down the road in a couple chapters that there are really 3 energy systems. We have our immediate energy system. That's one. How can I put my finger up so y'all can see it? There we go. Then we have our anaerobic energy system. That's 2. And then we're going to have our aerobic energy system. That's 3, okay? So the immediate is for when we need energy on demand right away. The anaerobic energy system is when we need it within a couple minutes. And then our aerobic energy system is what provides ATP from 2 minutes for multiple hours, okay? So throughout life, those 3 energy systems really always contribute. Some contribute more than the others, depending upon what we're doing at a given time. But again, all 3 of those are present in our cells to allow us to really have a steady supply of ATP available, because without ATP, guess what? The human organism will die, okay? So, not to move into somber territory, but that's the reality of it, okay? Now, with these energy systems, there are some key things that I want to introduce to you today, and then we're going to come back to in later chapters as well. But today we want to kind of just develop a fundamental understanding of the purpose of some of these things in our energy systems. And the first thing that we're going to talk about are what are known as enzymes, okay? Now, enzymes are proteins that are present in our cells, okay? And what these enzymes or these proteins do is they have the ability to alter the rate of a reaction. Okay, the rate of a reaction is the speed with which the reaction occurs. Okay. Now, ideally, especially when we're exercising, we want these chemical reactions to occur faster. Okay, because when we're exercising, the need for ATP really skyrockets, okay? Versus me sitting in this chair right now looking at the screen. Yes, I have a need for ATP, but it's relatively low, okay? Now, if I got up and went in my yard and started running around, my ATP requirements are going to skyrocket, okay? So my energy systems are going to kick in, and their activity is going to increase, okay, to produce more ATP. And again, ideally, I want that reaction to start, the reactions of energy production to start occurring faster, okay? So these enzymes, they exist to not allow the reaction to occur, but to accelerate the reactions, okay? So what we'll see a little bit today and more in the coming weeks is there are certain enzymes that are sensitive to certain conditions that might exist during exercise. So once a human starts exercising, these enzymes are stimulated to start speeding up the energy production process, okay? Coenzymes are less important for our discussion today, but coenzymes kind of interact with enzymes, again, to facilitate their action, or in other words, to allow the reactions to occur more smoothly and more easily, which in turn allows them to occur faster and at a greater rate, okay? Now, these words, I know, look intimidating, and we don't really need to worry about them today. This slide is really just showing you that enzymes are typically, any enzyme is going to end in the suffix ase. So notice all of these: lactate dehydrogenase, hexokinase, lipase. Anytime you see a word that ends in ase, in terms of biology or exercise physiology, it's probably referring to an enzyme, okay? And there are different classes of enzymes, as you see here, an oxoreductase, hydrolase, ligase, etc. And the trick with enzymes is the name of the enzyme will often tell you exactly what it does, okay? So this is a great example here. Lactate dehydrogenase. Now, lactate or lactic acid is something we're going to talk about a lot in the coming weeks, okay? When we're exercising, especially at a high intensity, lactate is produced. And ultimately, if too much lactate is produced, we have to stop exercising, okay? Lactate is composed of, among other things, hydrogen, okay? Hydrogen, when it accumulates in our body, can force us to have to, it can actually slow ATP production down, which in turn would make us have to stop exercising, okay? So what this enzyme does, lactate dehydrogenase. Think about that for a second. Again, the name of the enzyme tells you exactly what it does. So take 3 seconds to look at that name and think about, just guess what that enzyme might do or cause to happen. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Lactate dehydrogenase removes hydrogen from lactate, right? Again, the name tells you exactly what it does, okay? Now, these other ones, I'm not going to get into as much because they're not as clear-cut about the name with the function. But in the case of lactate dehydrogenase, it works pretty well. And there's going to be some other enzymes that are critical for energy production. And I'll talk through the name and what it means when we get to those things down the road, okay? But for right now, let's leave specific enzymes alone because I don't want to overwhelm you all with that today. Again, enzymes do ultimately speed reactions up, okay? But there are things that affect how well enzymes work, okay? First of all, a substrate is any molecule that an enzyme interacts with, okay? So in our body, there are literally hundreds of thousands of substrates, okay? For our purposes of today's discussion, let's consider that ATP is a substrate, all right? So the more ATP there is, the easier it is for the enzyme that interacts with ATP to do its thing, okay? So let me just kind of summarize this bullet point here. The number of the substrate, or the amount of ATP, okay, present will cause the enzyme that interacts with it to operate faster, okay? So the less ATP there is, the slower the enzyme will function. The more ATP present, the faster the reaction will occur, okay? And again, that's an added advantage when we're exercising, right? If we have a lot of glucose present, it's going to be easier to make ATP. If there's not as much glucose present, it's going to be harder to make ATP, okay? So the amount of the substrate present affects enzyme reaction rate, okay? And then, also important for exercise, these two things here. The pH, or the acidity of the environment, affects the rate of enzyme function, okay? And then the temperature can also affect enzyme activity as well. Let's go to the next slide and take a look at how exactly that process occurs. So notice here on the left, we have the temperature, and here on the right, we have the pH. Enzymes will operate best at an optimal temperature and an optimal pH. To explain this initially, let's focus on temperature because I think that's easier. Now, you all know normal resting human body temperature is what? Around 98.6 degrees, right? Now that's going to fluctuate slightly based upon the individual and what you're doing at a given time. But at rest, it should be around 98.6 degrees, okay? So let's imagine that that point is here on the graph. This is 98.6. And let's say that over here is 101, okay? You don't want to be over here, okay? Now what happens during exercise? As we identified earlier, due to energy being released as heat, your body temperature is going to elevate. And let's just say, for the sake of discussion today, maybe it's going to go up 1 degree Fahrenheit to 99.6, okay? So what that might represent on our graph would be here, okay? So at rest, 98.6. Enzymes are functioning, but not optimally. But enzymes do function optimally at a slightly higher body temperature. And again, just for today's discussion, let's imagine that's 99.6, okay? So during exercise, our body temperature increases, and that increase actually allows our enzymes to function better, okay? So again, that's an advantage during exercise. The heat that is produced during exercise actually facilitates more rapid energy production, okay? Energy production requires enzymes. Enzyme rate is increased at a higher body temperature. body temperature increases during exercise, so it works out well. Okay. Similar thing occurs over here with pH. Now these enzymes are not ones that are critical for energy production. Different enzymes will function optimally at different pHs. During exercise, some of the enzymes that are critical for energy production actually function better at a slightly higher pH than resting, okay? Which again is good during exercise because, again, I referred to lactic acid on the last slide. It's an acid. When lactic acid is present, our pH is going to become altered slightly and it's going to increase, okay? So imagine this is, let's say lactate dehydrogenase. That's the enzyme we talked about earlier. Normal resting body pH is here. Exercise pH is here, right? So enzyme function is optimized at a slightly higher pH than resting, and during exercise, that's an advantage, okay? So the conditions that exist during exercise actually promote more rapid enzyme function, and that allows for the reactions that the enzymes are governing to occur at a faster rate, which is a positive thing, okay? Now, I hope that didn't overwhelm you. Enzymes can be, I don't know, a little bit confusing because they're a very abstract concept. Just sort of leave it where this is for now today, and we'll talk about some specific enzymes and what they do in coming lectures, okay? For today's discussion, I just really want you to remember this slide, that there are different situations and conditions that can affect enzyme rate. Temperature and pH are the two critical ones for exercise, and the enzymes that govern energy production function best at slightly higher body temperatures and slightly higher pHs. Both of those things exist during exercise, which is a positive thing, okay? Now, we're not going to get into this too much, just to kind of summarize the enzyme. Now notice we mentioned the term substrate earlier. So here's an example of a substrate, maltose. We could also say ATP, since we've been talking about ATP. Just imagine this is ATP here. So this is the substrate. The enzyme is, again, its own protein. And notice how these things would fit together perfectly. A lot of people describe enzymes and substrates as kind of a lock and a key, okay? So the enzyme is the lock and the substrate is the key, and they fit together perfectly. Another substrate would not fit into this specific enzyme, right? So specific enzymes are engineered to fit with specific substrates, and ones that don't fit obviously don't bind together at all. But what we see is once these two things bind together at what is known as the active site, okay, now we have what is known as the enzyme substrate complex, okay? Sometimes other things will react with the complex, such as in this example, water, okay? And then ultimately the enzyme promotes this reaction, which in this case is the splitting of the glucose molecule, or if we were sticking with our ATP molecule example, what we would see is the splitting of the ATP molecule. So the enzyme essentially does its job, operates on the substrate in some way, and then the enzyme is released from the substrate and can then react with another molecule of the substrate, okay? Now, last thing on this, I promise, I know I tend to say that a lot. I'm not intentionally trying to lie to you all. I just think that we're coming to the end of a topic and there's actually more slides, okay? This, though, I'm pretty sure is the last thing about enzymes. Now, I mentioned earlier that certain conditions can speed up enzyme function. Well, conversely, there are other conditions which can slow down or inhibit enzyme function, okay? And this is important really for survival, especially when it comes to exercise, okay? Now, I mentioned earlier the chemical equation for ATP. So notice here it is. And again, we're going to come back and talk about this in a later lecture, but I wanted to introduce it right now because it's important for our inhibition discussion. When ATP binds with its enzyme, which is known as ATPase, okay, which would occur at this step, the ATP molecule is split apart into three things: ADP, adenosine diphosphate, inorganic phosphate, or PI, and then energy, right? So notice we have three phosphates here: ATP, adenosine triphosphate. When ATP interacts with this enzyme, those phosphates are busted apart, okay? And we still have three, two here, one here, but this one has become inorganic because the energy has essentially been stripped out of the chemical bond, leaving one of the phosphates as inorganic, okay? This energy is then used to produce mechanical work, to put it simply. What we're left with, though, are these byproducts, okay? ADP and inorganic phosphate. Now, after exercise, these things can be used to replenish ATP, okay? So this reaction is reversible, which means it can go in both ways. During exercise, it occurs this direction. Energy is used to produce mechanical work. In the post-exercise recovery phase, the reaction can go this direction, and we can produce ATP and replenish our ATP stores as we recover from exercise, okay? But during exercise, these things accumulating will actually have an inhibitory effect on enzymes, okay? As ADP and inorganic phosphate accumulate in cells, which they will do during exercise because we're constantly liberating this energy to allow us to continue to perform this mechanical work of running or lifting weights or whatever, we're accumulating a lot of these byproducts, okay? As these things accumulate, that's sort of a signal to the body that, okay, this person is exercising, and the longer they go, the more fatigue they should be getting, and they are going to need to stop exercising, okay? So what happens is as these two byproducts, ADP and inorganic phosphate, accumulate, they start to inhibit the enzymes that allow us to produce more ATP, okay? And ultimately, and what would that do? Well, that would slow ATP production down, okay? So if I'm running, let's say 10 miles, and I'm at mile 8, I've been exercising now for 30 to 40 minutes, right? Requiring a constant need for ATP. At that point, at mile 8, I've accumulated a lot of these byproducts, okay? So as these byproducts accumulate, my enzyme function becomes inhibited. And that's going to slow down the rate of ATP production. And what effect is that going to have on me? What am I going to perceive as I'm trying to complete that 10-mile run? Energy is low. Energy production is slowed down, so energy supplies are low. What am I going to feel? Fatigue, right? You're going to feel tired. You're going to start to feel fatigued because energy supplies are running low. Energy supplies are running low because energy production has become inhibited due to the presence of these inhibitory molecules, okay? Now, there are other things occurring as well that explain fatigue, which we'll talk about down the road, but essentially all of them have to do with what I just mentioned, right? These byproducts are accumulating due to us exercising, and these byproducts start to inhibit energy production by slowing down the rate of enzyme reaction, okay? Which is a good thing, because if we kept on exercising indefinitely, we could die, right? So these inhibitory processes exist ultimately to preserve our life, right? The human organism ultimately wants to survive, okay? That's why we have the drive to eat food. That's why we have the drive to stop exercising, because we don't want to produce so much damage in our body that we can't recover from it, okay? So this kind of represents sort of a check and balance system, that as our energy production has been sustained at a high level for a long period of time, intuitively the body knows that cannot be continued forever. So we have to have this check and balance system that exists to ultimately, or eventually I should say, make us rest. Okay, so everything can then be restored back to normal resting function, or a term that I really should have introduced to you earlier that I'll make sure I talk about more later. We want to restore homeostasis. Okay, that's a key word that I will open the next lecture with, because that's really important to this discussion that we're having today. Okay. All right, so other processes, I don't want to talk about this today, but just again, this would be something else that requires energy. Part of the bioenergetic process is, again, converting energy from the non-usable form, which is listed here, into the usable form, okay? We have to add inputs to that in order for it to occur, and that's what hydrolysis is. That's adding water to a reaction to allow it to occur. And we actually saw that back on this slide, right? We added water in order for us to ultimately get this glucose. We have to add water to it, and that's a process known as hydrolysis. Again, not important to our discussion today, but I don't want to just skip by a slide and not talk about it. Hydrolysis is actually removing water. Condensation is adding water. Okay, all chemical reactions in the body require water. That's why water is something we need to consume essentially constantly, because our energy systems, etc., cannot operate properly without a constant input of water. Here is another example of the chemical reactions occurring. In this case, this is hydrolysis, which is I think I said that backwards earlier. I apologize. Hydrolysis is adding the addition of water to a molecule to allow it for its conversion. Okay, carbohydrate, protein. Down here, condensation is the removal of water, again, to allow conversion of one form of energy into another. Okay, this process is very much what occurs during digestion. As we consume carbohydrates, sugars in our diet, such as sucrose, dextrose, etc., we have to convert that form of carbohydrate energy into another form, which is glucose. Glucose can then enter into our different energy systems and ultimately allow us to produce ATP. Okay. Last topic, as we're approaching we've actually passed the 45-minute mark, and I promised you all I would try to keep lectures to 45 minutes or so. The last type of reaction I want to mention, and this is again a complicated one, but one we're going to come back to, are what is known as redox reactions. Okay, redox is short for reduction, oxidation, or oxidation and reduction. Okay, another key component of energy production, as I mentioned way earlier in the lecture, is the removal of electrons. Okay, ultimately, we produce ATP by stripping the electrons out of those macronutrients that we talked about earlier. Okay, electrons are often bound to oxygen. Okay, so we have two different types of reactions that are sort of what we call coupled reactions. They always occur together, that involve the transferring of oxygen and the associated electrons. Okay, oxidation reactions involve the transferring of oxygen from one molecule to another. Okay, in the removal of an electron. Okay, so an electron, you might remember, is a negatively charged molecule, not a molecule. So when we remove an electron from something, we make that molecule more positive. Okay, that's oxidation. Oxidation occurs while we are producing energy in our aerobic energy production. Okay, reduction, on the other hand, involves the gaining of an electron. Okay, so since an electron is a negatively charged molecule, adding a negative makes a number smaller. So that's the memory trick I always used in my mind to remember how these reactions occur. Reduction, which on its own means making something smaller. Reduction involves adding an electron. An electron is a negative. When we add a negative number to something, it makes it smaller. Okay, so that's a reduction reaction. Makes a molecule more negative, makes it smaller. Okay. Oxidation, on the other hand, is going to make something more positive because it removes the electron from it. Now, these are coupled because electrons cannot exist on their own in our cytosol, in our cellular fluid. They have to be transferred from one thing to another. So an oxidation and a reduction always occur together. We have to transfer the electron from something to something else. Okay. For example, we strip the electron off a glucose molecule and we add it to an adenosine diphosphate molecule to produce ATP. We're transferring one thing to the other. Okay. The glucose becomes oxidized because we've taken the electron from it. The ATP becomes reduced because we've added the electron to it. Okay. And then later, we oxidize the ATP by pulling the electron from it. Okay. So again, these reactions always occur in a coupled fashion. We will go much more into this once we get into aerobic energy production down the road, because that is primarily where these redox reactions occur. And again, redox is just sort of a shorthand way to say reduction oxidation reactions. These occur ultimately, in the aerobic energy system. The aerobic energy system can be divided into two sub cycles. The Krebs cycle is one, and then the electron transport chain, or the respiratory chain as it is sometimes called. In those two cycles, that's where electrons are harvested from these different molecules and used to produce ATP. Okay, we can produce tremendous amounts of ATP in the aerobic energy system by oxidizing these molecules, taking electrons from them to produce ATP molecules. Okay, and we'll see that in detail, and probably more detail than you all really want to see it in coming lectures. Okay, so the summary, just make sure that you read over these few bullet points. There are 2 slides here that kind of summarize what we talked about today. Your tasks for the week: you have your chapter 5 lecture study questions. Okay, here's 5 questions. You can answer these in, single word, short phrase. You do not have to use complete sentences for the lecture study questions. Just kind of answer them in as few words as possible. Makes it easier for you to do them, makes it easier for me to grade them as well. Okay, that's worth 5 points, basically 1 point per question. And then you also have your chapter 5 critical thinking assignment. So this one is one that I would like for you to do in complete sentence paragraph format. I've asked you a question relating to the energy transfer, and I kind of gave you the answer for the question already. So if you think back to what we talked about in the lecture, then you know where I'm going for the critical thinking. Okay, and the critical thinking assignments, again, are not something that are always going to necessarily have a right or wrong answer. What I want you all to do is to start thinking, using your brain to figure stuff out. Okay. Sometimes we come to the right conclusion, sometimes we come to the wrong conclusion, but that's okay. That's what thinking is all about. Okay, so I'm going to sign off for today. Make sure that if you all have any questions, any concerns, any comments, email me. Use the discussion boards. I'm not going to formally require you to use the discussion boards, but if you have questions, especially ones that other students might want to know the answer to as well, using the discussion board would be a good idea, because then I can share the answer with everybody. Okay, so Professor Jet signing off for this week. I'll come back and talk to you all next week. Hope you're enjoying the first couple weeks of classes. Take care.